Welcome, Raz. How you doing?
No, I'm pretty good, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm all right. Welcome, everyone, to Classic Amateurs podcast. This is the working title. We might change, we might not. I like it.
Good enough, good enough.
Yeah. Last week we talked about fear and loading in Las Vegas, and before that, Dostoevsky. And this week, what are we talking about, Raz?
Well, I was thinking we spend some time talking about a different type of classic.
Okay.
Often we think of classics are, I think one definition that I've heard of classic is a book that is worth rereading, or it maintains value beyond the time that it was written, right? And the book that I was thinking about today was Zero to One by Peter Thiel.
Okay.
Have you ever heard of the book or the author?
I vaguely remember hearing his name. I have no idea what it is,
Hmm.
but I'm very excited to learn.
Peter Thiel is a very fascinating guy to me. I'm genuinely fascinated with him. So he's the Stanford grad. I think he was born in Germany and then emigrated to the US when he was one. Very much a San Francisco area type of person. Was the co-founder of PayPal, which is by definition, one of the earliest fintechs. I think they started off with the vision of creating a online currency, the Bitcoin of the days of the 90s. And
Yeah.
they repivoted eventually to thinking more of online payments that work through email. So that
Is
was a
he
big
friends
break.
with Elon?
That's when he was in competition with Elon and then in collaboration with Elon. They started off at different companies and they kind of merged. That's where the motto "competition is for suckers" comes into play. I'll talk about it
Sure.
later on. And then
Yeah, is this like a Steve Jobs and Bill Gates situation?
in a way, because I think Bill Gates ended up getting on the board of Apple and co-investing when Apple was at its worst. So yeah, if
Yeah.
that's what you mean, yeah, definitely. And I still struggle to understand that episode, but it played out pretty well for both of them. Then,
Cool.
so Peter Thiel was after he had this big break. I think he was one of the earliest investor in Facebook, so he had a huge win with that. And then he stayed. He's mainly a venture capitalist now, and he is the founder of Palantir, which is one of those iconic
I know
stocks you hear
Palantir.
about on social media. Do a lot of government work.
I know people working for Palantir.
That's pretty cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
so they use kind of data, but as well as they do believe kind of in the combination of data and analytics, AI, and also maintaining kind of a human sovereignty over decision making. That combination between man and machine as being the optimal way of getting to insights and decisions. What was also striking to me about Peter Thiel is that he's a contrarian for many reasons. So he's kind of was the only conservative person in Silicon Valley, which you might be aware is very much a democratic left wing type of
Hmm.
population, and he was one of the guys that was campaigning for Trump early on. He was like, I'm proud to be gay. He's also gay. I'm proud to be gay, and I'm proud to be a conservative. Was his kind of some of the way he was leading the speeches, which is very very surprising at the time.
Interesting
Standing,
vision.
yeah, especially combining the two, which seemed kind of opposites. And no, just really decent guy from what I've seen. Very kind of a polymath, strong interest in philosophy and religion as well, which comes through this book as well, which is basically a business book.
Yeah.
But it has a very strong, clearly strong foundation in what he's been reading and kind of distilling in his own thinking. And well, the reason I wanted to discuss it, I think it's a classic, is I think it stands the test of time. And there's some interesting things about it that I wanted to test with you, that to prove that effectively. Is it still worth? I think it's still worth reading it. I read it a few months ago, and I absolutely enjoy it. I enjoy rereading it. And I
Cool.
think why don't we just dive right into it? Sorry, did you want to say anything about?
Well, if I'm the test of time in this case, I hope I don't fail it at my test, or I don't fail at the test. I don't know who are we testing here, the book or me.
So I think the basic framework of this book is effectively a note on startups and how to build innovation, how to build companies, which is very very interesting to us, right? I mean, every time you start a new endeavor, you kind of have to work through why you're doing it and what are you trying to solve, what problems you're trying to solve with it, even if it's just for yourself at the beginning and then maybe for others. Just like when you're doing a podcast, why are we doing this? Something about classical amateurs. What is
This
it
is
about
the
classic?
startup.
This is it. Why would even start having this conversation about something such as classics and why are we fascinated with classics? I think to understand a little bit the way he's thinking, I wanted to test with you the way he sometimes thinks about what is the best interview question, which is what what the way he asked the question is more like what fundamental truths, and this is a question for you now, Norm. What fundamental truths do you believe that very few people would agree with you on? Can you name one, at least one thing where you think not a lot of people agree with you, but you definitely believe it's true?
Wow.
That's a tough one.
Okay. Yeah, I thought you were gonna ask me what my favorite color is. I was like so excited, but now I'm like, shit, we are going deep. All right,
But
so
that's the
fundamental.
contrarian question. I mean, if the point of asking this question will I give you time to think about it, is then if you want to start something, usually you have to be equipped with something that no one else knows. It's kind of the essence is the secret. The secret. What is the thing that you know better than very few people would otherwise be aware of, which is kind of the essence of individualism to some extent. What is it that is truly your own that no one else can have access to or even is even aware of?
Okay, this introduced some complexity to the question, but
No, but let's
if
go
I
back to just the truth. Something that you believe that if you told maybe me or your partner, maybe she or I wouldn't agree with, but you definitely
okay,
think it's true.
okay, so one thing I believe is true, and I met a lot of people who don't agree, is that everyone needs what I call a fuck around time. The idea that you can, work 8 hours a day, maybe sleep 7, 8, 9 hours a day, but then in between, there's a time when you're just unable to be productive, when your brain is just fried. Because when you look at like management books or you look at even like, I guess, self-help books, they often say like you gotta, or they often imply that you are building a new life that's all productive, always creating something. Every moment you spend with building something new for yourself or for others. But in my opinion, as good as it sounds, everyone needs fuck around time. When you're just useless, when you just sit and stare in the distance, or I don't know, you watch a silly movie or that sort of stuff, and you should just accept it. That's my, I guess,
I
is it
love it.
unpopular opinion? I don't
I
know.
like now that you mention it. I agree with you on both things. I think most people are unaware or think in that terms. Now that you've mentioned it, I like it. See, that's the revelation. I agree with you. I think to some extent this is fuck around time. It's kind of unstructured. We put a placeholder and then we kind of let it loose. I've seen a TED talk that talked about the power of procrastination. You are actually coming up with new things when you're not doing anything, and
Sure.
sometimes you need that to come up with an answer. Like kids would often procrastinate until the due date of their essay, right? Because they're actually thinking in the background while they're doing other things. They're trying to figure out an answer. That's very common with kids and even with us. And the more problems become more and more complex, you kind of need that buffer for your brain to process silently in the background, to sleep on it, to whatever,
Yeah.
until you come up with the right idea. I think that's
I guess
amazing, valuable, immensely valuable.
I guess just one more thing, and then I'll let you talk about this because obviously this shouldn't be the focus. Is that the reason I came up with fuck around time is because I know quite a few people who said, I was planning to do all these things, all these XYZ stuff that I really wanted to work on. I had this vision. I wanted to read the books or I wanted to build a new thing at home, but I just didn't have time. I couldn't help myself. I was just sitting there and not doing anything. And I said, look, you shouldn't feel bad. It's just fuck around time. All right, but go for it.
No, I absolutely love it. So that's the type of thinking that he's promoting in this
Yeah.
book. Go back to kind of what is truly sort of your own, truly unique. And then he kind of uses this framework coming back to the companies, right? Once the companies are built around the idea of secrets that, as you say, something that other people don't realize, right? Whether it's like Airbnb that some guys also realize, look, everyone's has this room in their apartment, big American houses or Australian houses. You can just put a mattress in there and rent it out when there's high demand for at a conference or something, because demand can be quite volatility for accommodation, and hotels
Mhm.
can't really match that. And those guys kind of saw something that worked that no one else believed in for a very long time. And then eventually, with the help of some early promoters, they managed to get that off the ground. Anyway, there's just, and kind of every idea is the same, right? Facebook, the idea that, okay, social media matters, right? And a lot of people tried all sorts of social media platforms, but never with true identity. You could always be kind of a horse or an avatar or something. And ultimately, when they actually started small with Harvard students, where they actually put their faces and real identity, that's when it actually took off and spread everywhere. Realizing the key being personal identity matters, and 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 kind of matters at the core, right, of adoption more than anywhere, and then it spreads out pretty well. And kind of every idea starts the same way. But I think starting off with a bit of context, the reason why he's approaching this book, he has this, so the 0 to 1. The way he thinks about it is kind of binary. So as just for context, when he thinks about a business, he thinks in terms of two axes. One is the vertical axis, which is effectively how new, whether it's new or not, whether it's truly innovative. Technology by definition is defined as doing kind of more with less, right? On one axis, and on the other one, that's the 0 to 1 thing. That's the true innovation. And then the other one is effectively more copying across. So when you think about innovation, Silicon Valley is the 0 to 1 space where new things happen. And then the 1 to N horizontal axis is copying. It's effectively China. China doesn't really come up with new things, but it's amazingly good at copying and scaling things that already exist in the West, and it's catching up. So his main concern was, look, actually, we live in a situation where we talk a lot about the developing world and the developed world, and a lot of the growth in the world is happening in China and everywhere, but it's not true innovation. It's not on the vertical axis. It's just a scaling of things that are already happening in the West. So his main context and premise for the book was there's been a lot of innovation in the world, but a lot of it in the world of bits in Western Europe, not so much in anything else. Whereas in the rest of the world, everyone's catching up with the developed world. So, what is the true growth story for the developed world? Actually, he's arguing that we live, and that's the contrarian idea, we live in a world of stagnation. And it's very provocative to think that we live in a world of stagnation, but then he brings, also for context, a few things that might support that idea. For instance, if you we're in an age of stagnation compared to the 60s when everybody was imagining the Jetsons, flying cars. Now we can't even do autonomous vehicles well yet, although there's a lot of buzz around that. Back in the 60s, right, we had very little technology where you could put people on the moon, whereas we actually haven't been very successful at scaling that, and we've gone back on that quite a bit. So there's been a lot of innovation in the world of atoms, how in the world of bits, how information travels. We've been extremely effective at that, but we're very actually reductionist or regressive in other forms of innovation in the world of atoms, manufacturing, energy. Energy hasn't become cheaper effectively, despite solar is still more expensive than oil, and oil itself, despite everything, despite the inflation, everything is still at a higher level than it used to be in the 60s from a price perspective. We're still a very energy intensive society, and if China and India copy that, right, that's the 1 to N factor. There's no real efficiency, right? There's just more and more of the same, and ultimately
Yeah.
leads to zero sum games. Without true innovation on the 0 to 1 axis, you're actually faced ultimately with, right, that what you see emerging today, which is the conflict between West and China, because China is kind of slowing down as they've kind of copied almost everything. They're arriving at a level where um, there's no much more growth, and if you don't have growth and technological growth, there's no incentive to just kind of focus on yourself, have a competitive advantage, and then maybe trade works, because if you're all kind of at parity, and trade stops working the same way, you're actually in a conflict for resources pretty quickly. This is all
Well,
just for context, why he wrote the business book,
yeah,
but I
yeah.
find that fascinating.
Uh-huh. I see. There used to be this running joke, and I don't know what to compare. It was back when I lived in Budapest, but I can give you a joke with London. Like the joke was that the Chinese copy a lot. They create their own version of everything, right? Which is fun, but they often copy so well that it's just like the original. And living in London, it came up like probably somewhere in China there is like a perfect replica of London. And someone was joking that maybe they copied it, but they copied it years ago. So the prime minister or the mayor of London is still the previous one, and they still haven't fucked up some stuff. It
See,
was just
that's the thing. That's the problem with copying. It's slow, right? It doesn't. They do a great job at mirroring, but then there's a lag between that, and it's kind of
sure.
there's an inertia that he was.
But anyway, I have no problem with China copying anything. But if I understand correctly, so we have the vertical axis with old and new, and the horizontal axis with something like individual, almost a single product, to something skilled. So something that's manufactured,
That's
right?
right. So if you think of economic growth, for instance, the 0 to 1 vertical axis is coming up with new shit,
Mm-hmm.
genuinely new things. So efficiency, like doing more with less, genuine increments, improvements. That's one area of growth in the world. So that's that's been the main vector of growth in the 20th century, versus what we've seen in the last 20 years, maybe since the 80s, which is one to N scaling that. So that's when outsourcing came into it, globalization. All of that has effectively taken existing technology that was developed in the West and then scaling it in the world. So that's been copying effectively. All of that
Sure.
contributed to growth, nonetheless, but it's a different type of growth. It's not the one that is in line with the projections that we had in the 60s, and therefore his argument that this is a hidden form of stagnation, because it's not in line with what we believed. I mean, we thought we would be on Mars. We thought that in 2001 it'd be like the space odyssey, right, where you go to Jupiter and so on. And after, we've actually fallen quite a lot. And if you we're actually quite pessimistic. COVID aside, relationship with China, the Chinese themselves are quite pessimistic about their future. Maybe Australia is. There's the other myth, which is it's kind of the opposite, which is exceptionalism. We believe that regardless of everything that's happened, and we were kind of blind to the stagnation, and we think we're exceptional, right? In Australia, it will never property prices will never go down. We'll always have growth, which I'll get to that towards the end, is also not a given. So this is effectively called innovation will happen whether we want it or not. Robots will take over the world is the type of thinking. No matter what we do, robots will take over the world. And the problem with that thinking is basically that it's a form of kind of a autopilot nihilism, because it just assumes that regardless of human agency, the world would just converge to that singularity, what is effectively that endless point of innovation. And the truth is, if you think like that, chances are things don't move at all because you're just assuming things are going to happen, but you're not actually doing anything about it. It's like
Yeah.
it's basically the environment that we have today, where we see a lot of printing of money, you see a lot of high returns, all the asset prices are going up, right? And you just we're basically in a monetary bubble, property bubble, stock price bubble, and then you're just assuming, yeah, that's actually a reflection that we're going to be better off in the future. But who is actually doing anything different to increase productivity, technological innovation to support this growth? What's actually sitting behind? When on the contrary, right, we have less access to chips. Property, building a house is more expensive than before. So all the fundamentals underneath the monetary are actually worse. We're just delaying realization of that for the moment.
I
So
really, it really depresses me that we might never have the Jetsons.
It is. It sucks, right? Because I really like the design on those apartments.
Yeah, great.
Those flying cars were amazing. So going back to Earth a little bit, I think he was talking about this. Book was written, I think, closer to the years 2000, and no, it was 2014. It was published first, but it did have some lessons from the first dot-com bubble because we've been going through bubbles quite a lot in the last 20 years, right? We had the dot-com bubble, the GFC, and then I think call it whatever you want, but there's definitely
COVID
something
bubble.
rotten in Denmark right now. We're definitely in a monetary bubble and with QE. So the things that people thought about innovation before were like, oh, you can just make incremental advances and then that's fine as long as you stay lean. It's all about being lean in an organization. You always have to look at your competition and be better than your competition. This thinking, this mindset that you're always competing against someone was kind of the old way of thinking. And then this is maybe Silicon Valley biased. You just focus on the right product. You don't care about how you sell it, and that's going to work. And what the dot-com bubble later revealed that now is the key to success of some of the innovation in the world of bits, at least that is happening, is that, and this may be applicable to us as life advice. I would say, it's better to risk being bold than doing something trivial, right? That's something we kind of struggle a lot, right? Ourselves. I personally my biggest fear is just doing something trivial that doesn't make any difference, doesn't have any impact, right? So I prefer making mistakes, taking a little risk. And then a bad plan is better than no plan. I mean, I agree. But all plans, the moment you issue a plan, it's going to be flawed, but at least you've got something going on, something to look forward
So
to.
this Peter or in your context whoever you are talking about is aligned well with the lean startup philosophy, like fail fast, fail a lot or something, that sort of stuff, or you reckon this is a different approach?
Well, I think it says all companies must be lean, but which is code for unplanned. He's basically questioning the idea that planning is arrogant and inflexible. Um, it's true that you should iterate, right? But you have to be aware that entrepreneurship is kind of an agnostic experimentation, right? But which is actually he actually disagrees. I think every single time he actually believes that having a plan, even if it's wrong, is better than no plan and just assuming things will eventuate. I think that's what he's criticizing. In reality, you kind of need a bit of both, right? But having a plan, something you're aiming towards, is really really important, even if it's wrong. And I gave the example at the beginning. The guys when they started PayPal were thinking about having a digital currency, not necessarily cryptocurrency, but definitely an internet-based currency. That didn't work out, but ultimately they repivoted into something else, which was online payments. And then they found the use case, which was eBay at the time, which
Sure.
had a horrible way, a lot of mistrust, and the parties couldn't really settle their payments, and they became the intermediary of those transactions. Ultimately, solving for that, something that eBay themselves couldn't solve for, and they ended up actually being bought by eBay later on for many billions of dollars. Anyway, just to finish kind of the ideas here, his main criticism, and this is what's really contrarian, I think that we've been brainwashed in economics. If you've studied economics like myself, I think
I did.
what they teach us is effectively that the best markets are um, those, what are they called? I think it was not monopolistic, but they did have a term which was the perfect markets, right? The
The
perfect
perfect
markets,
competition.
yeah, with perfect
No market.
competitions are the ideal market. That's what capitalism brings. Capitalism brings, in the end state, well, a situation where no one earns unfair profits or something like that, right? Because if it's an attractive market, you'll always have new entrants that will compete that profit away, right?
Surplus
Yeah,
profit. So
and
it's the
that
idea
yeah,
that
surplus.
you earn the market rate, right?
That's right.
So
And this basically is the best outcome for customers is the
uh,
ideology. And the biggest paradigm shift for me was actually, and this is what I'm struggling to be comfortable with, I think, is that competitive markets actually destroy profits, and that the best businesses, if you want to be in a business, tying back to having a secret, you have to be comfortable with being the only person doing it and effectively having a monopoly over that. And that monopoly, he distinguishes a bit between good monopoly and bad monopoly.
mm,
So a bad monopoly is kind of like it has a tendency towards corruption. It's kind of regulatory imposed. Think of like Telstra before being privatized. The only telco company, it's government backed. It's the government effectively, and you have really shitty service. They don't invest in customer service, and you have no option, and you have no way of doing it. Versus a good monopoly, Google. So Google, right? It's when at least when it first started, right? It was no one else could do it, right? They're definitely doing a much better job than all the other search engines at the time because they're actually algorithm based,
Sure.
and they actually took up the market away from everyone else through their own merit, right? And that's a good type of firm because they were doing something that they knew and themselves how to do, and no one else. And
But
then
then you don't think that monopolies are just have the tendency of getting corrupted? Isn't that the point of being against monopolies? That, you know, I mean, beyond the idea that, how do you define monopolies? That's another
And
contentious
that's
topic.
a question of he goes through this book. Do you believe that Google has a monopoly on search, but does it have a monopoly on technology? Because it depends what it positions itself at, and that market can be as small or as big as you want. Is Google synonymous with the advertising industry? Is Google synonymous with the technology industry? Google doesn't have a monopoly on technology, although it's trying to portray itself as the alphabet, right, of technology. All technology could be Google, and within that market, it has a very small share. Within advertising, it's acting pretty monopolistic, and that's a very very interesting nuance that you now need to tread. But I think the main point is that if you have to think as a kind of a business owner. If you don't want to be the owner of a company that is part of that perfect competition market, you will starve. You cannot stay in business. You need to earn a surplus of profit to be worthwhile for you to stay in
Mhm.
business. So it's actually basically that's wrong. It's wrong to believe that you can just kind of earn the market rate because if you that is fake. The market rate effectively is that you've got a million people competing for it, and then actually you're out of business. And it's a bit like labor can be sometimes like that, right? So being employed is a bit like that, especially when you're in a global world, globalization. You're highly substitutable, right? So your labor doesn't earn you any salary, any surplus of income because you're substituted with someone in another market like China or India, and all of a sudden, um, it's kind of not worthwhile. You're actually
I mean, look,
starving.
sure. Look, the economist in me wants to argue with you a lot right now, but the honest answer is that, yeah, ideally we want to earn some profit. Market rate is a profit as well, sure, but to stay in reality, it's more than that. Sure, I get that.
But this market rate is just something fictional. It doesn't really exist. It's just all theoretical. In practice, you want to be in a business that makes money. That's all it means,
Yeah,
and which
sure.
is kind of a truth, right? An axiom. And just a kind of some advice around building companies, which neither of us have any experience with, but it's good to think about. The equivalent of the question that I asked you at the beginning about what is a truth that very few people agree with you on, fuck around time, is the contrarian version of that for the business. Starting a business is what valuable company is no one building? I'm not going
What
to ask you. Do you
valuable?
want to? Do you want to answer that question?
What was that? What valuable
A
company?
company that offers fuck around time would be basically the
Ooh,
business idea.
ooh. That's a hard one because I feel like my approach to fuck around time is psychological, right? It's the idea that you shouldn't feel bad for not being able to achieve anything. But like, how would I do a business around it? That's a good question. I guess meditation apps would be like a business idea. We have meditation apps; they exist already. I can't think of anything else at the
Mm.
moment.
Well, I think definitely doing a podcast is a shitty idea according to this framework, right? Because if you want to create and capture, basically there are two elements: creating value and capturing value. So he
Hmm.
gives this example of Albert Einstein, right? He came up with the relativity theory, right? That's an amazing innovation in
Yeah.
itself, and it was highly lucrative. It created nuclear energy, right? It created nuclear submarines, whatever, immensely valuable in terms of technological output and GDP output. But did Einstein actually capture any value of that? So that's where the idea of monopoly comes into play. It's not enough to have a great idea that unlocks a lot of value. You have to be able to capture some of that. And if you want to do that, you have to build a differentiated type of business, not a undifferentiated commodity business such as podcasting in today's world.
Well, it sounds like to me that we need to use this book to gain a monopoly over podcasting. We'll just have to, maybe have to copy everyone else's podcast. We do the China method, and
Mm.
next week we start to talk about true crime, and then we go into, I don't know, fashion.
I
Just
think
like that.
absolutely. I think the idea exactly is that you don't want to aim so big, right? If Google would have gone for saying we are the world's technology company, it would have never won. If it would have gone and said we are the world's advertising company, they would have never won. What they actually did is they got really good at one specific niche, and that's where they won, and then they scaled out of that. And
Sure.
so he uses this great classic analogy to Anna Karenina, which is, as you remember, the beginning of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy is um, all happy families are kind of the same. All unhappy families are unhappy in their own way,
Hmm.
and he
I
uses
never
this.
read it, so but I believe you. It sounds good.
Right? So you kind of understand there's a kind of a archetypal formula to families. Well, and this is the opposite with building companies. All unhappy companies are the same. They're all the commodity and commoditized ones. All the happy companies are all different. You need to have something different if you want to be
Sure.
happy as a company that no one else
You,
has.
you need to be competitive in your own way,
Mm.
right? It's in a way you have to monopolize your advantage and
Yeah,
build
but
on that.
you have to almost be so good that you don't think of competition. You're in your own league of your own. And if you're just doing incremental stuff on someone else's, you'll never work. I think there was another rule of thumb or heuristics is that whatever you do has to be 10 times as good as anyone else if you really want to succeed as a startup, right? So this podcast needs to be 10 times as good at talking about classics than someone else, which will never be. But it's probably 10 times as good as fucking around about
Oh,
classics, which
oh,
probably
come
no one
on!
else does.
This podcast is already 15 times better than any other podcast.
No, but you get the idea. That's kind of
So,
breakthrough innovation. And then, I've already talked about the idea that, there's kind of this ideology with competition. So I think the two extremes that he brings in, I'm walking you through the whole book right now because it's all notes. So I hope you don't mind. I can go a bit faster, but um,
sure, I'm just thinking that we probably want to wrap up in a few minutes. So I guess
ah,
maybe highlight any important points that you want to do
okay, I'll go
or
real quick. Yeah,
go
give me
over.
five minutes. So one thing I like is about this ideology of competition that I was mentioning before, because I think the extreme of that is Marx. He parallels Marx to Shakespeare, right? In the world of Marx, people fight because they're different. So the proletariat fights the bourgeoisie because they have completely different ideas and goals. It's kind of randomly generated by Marx, and so the greater the difference is, the greater the conflict. In
Sure.
the world of Shakespeare, by contrast, all combatants are pretty much the same. And then if you have Romeo and Juliet with two households, both alike in dignity, the houses are alike, but they hate each other because they're alike. So when they grow, their feud escalates effectively as well, and to the point where they actually forget about why they were fighting in the first place. And that's the biggest problem with competition, is actually the
Yeah,
world of
but
Shakespeare.
you see, the problem with Romeo and Juliet is that they are Italians. They
Which
just
has some of the craziest feuds.
yeah. No, I'm just kidding. I love Italians. Fair enough. Fair
There,
enough.
okay. There's a lot of things that I kind of like about these books. He's kind of I love some of the frameworks. He's kind of framing things into another matrix. He likes matrices. One is kind of the optimistic, pessimistic vertical axis, and the other one is the relationship to complexity and uncertainty. Whether you feel kind of confident about things versus you find things to be really chaotic, definite versus undefinite. So the world of the US in the 50s and 60s, the one we see in the old Hollywood, That's, a manufacturing thing, growth, double-digit growth. That's the optimistic but kind of certain world. The US of today is a lot more still optimistic. People still believe, or the Australia of today, people still believe in the future, but they're aware there's a high uncertainty with regards to it. And I think he's contrasting that with two other worlds, which I actually really like and agree with. At least one is the China of the present, which is there's a lot of concrete things happening. There's a lot of people like it's a top-down system, right? It's all about order.
Sure.
However, people are very pessimistic. They've got a strong risk aversion. I think they know shit can blow up at any moment. Evergrande blows up, systemic risk, the whole house of cards drops, right? It's enough not to
Yeah.
have the same 6% growth year on year for things to fuck up. Versus the last kind of quadrant is a world full of chaos where you're also pessimistic, which is Europe, actually. Europe today,
Sure.
is kind of not feeling it. They don't really know where it's going. They realize there's a lot of complexity. They don't have the growth story or direction that China has. It's just a shit show, right? Uh,
To be fair, if you read European literature, you realize that they never really know where it's going. They're always a bit just depressed.
so I think he basically goes down. Okay, so that's another framework for understanding kind of how world again sees things. Obviously, he's a big fan of living within that quadrant of indefinite complexity, but optimism, right? That's where we want to live in. That's where it's livable, right? I think that's the reason why. That's what I like effectively. And in order to do that, you have to be comfortable with kind of secrets and developing your own secrets, your own individual ideas about things. Ultimately, he is a libertarian after all. So the way you solve problems, according to Thiel, is through your own individual resources and the secrets that you have that no one else has. So the question is, what do you do with a secret? Do you tell people? Who do you tell? Do you tell your closest people, your co-founders? Do you tell everybody? And then you risk being like Einstein, right? Amazing genius that doesn't capture any value from the brilliance of his mind. So the
Sure.
secrets are very, very important. I'm just skipping through. I think then I think there's a great the book in the second part has a great case study on clean tech, actually clean tech. So
Yeah.
and why cleantech failed in the 2000s. So there was a big cleantech funding bubble. Everybody thought, we could develop, so solar would be cheaper than oil and all that, and it's
I
going to
see.
take over the world. And then in the end, everything folded. All these companies went bankrupt, and they all accused the Chinese for copying the American technology at lower costs and all the plus, the solar panels and so on.
With
No
with
one made any money from cleantech.
yeah. With that, not so much clean tech, but what you were talking about, like him being libertarian and talking about solving issues coming from you. Like, does in the same time, I feel like there's a contradiction of him talking about economies and how country one versus country two, USA, China, Australia, whatever, has developed. Because that's all a very collective approach to things, while a lot of the innovation is individual. Like, where does he stand on that? Like, does he see a country's economy as a sum of individuals, or I guess synergies and all that other side aside, or does he see as more like a collective that we have to work together to move forward?
Yeah, so I definitely think he's very much kind of on the right of that. As a libertarian, he believes in individual agency. So
Yeah,
the economy is built bottom up by individual choices, people
sure,
that allocate resources. It's not the state, it's not the government. There will always be an inferior way of allocating resources. It's not going to be the humanistic way. It's anything but ultimately totalitarian. So he's very much for individual freedom
sure,
of that, and that's why I think he's still banking on the ability of the U.S. and the West, or
sure.
the U.S., UK, Australia, Canada, which are kind of libertarian capitalist societies, in coming up with the answers that will take the developed world, not the developing world, on that axis, the vertical axis from 0 to 1. Basically, that's the
And
answer.
so that's his view on the future. That the I guess the individualistic capitalistic societies will still be able to kick some ball?
I think he's optimistic, but then he's optimistic with a sense of caution. If anything, he's trying to be more pessimistic just to be provocative.
Mhm.
So you can either believe two things. One is stagnation, the other one is, as I mentioned at the beginning, singularity. Things will just evolve towards this innovation, whether we do anything or not. So he's
Yeah,
cautioning against both. We may be in an era of stagnation today, and we might be in a like we might think that things are going too good, and in fact, as you can see, things are not going very well. So if you look at people's inequality, is effectively a symptom, not necessarily of the rich taking more and more, but it's effectively a symptom of the majority of population um, not capturing any of the value they create, and society not creating enough value ultimately for most of people in the economy, to the point where salaries adjusted for inflation have not grown in the Western world. Compared to the kind of the middle of the century, or the before the 70s, the oil shocks, especially when you adjust for dual household incomes. Effectively, now you have the same household income, or adjusted for inflation, but two people are working instead of one. That was a huge so what for me, right? Where basically there's not enough innovation in Western societies to basically yeah, to even be described as a success story from a growth perspective. The other element is to say, we're going to be taken over by robots, that we're all going towards the singularity. There's nothing we can do about it. Let's just put our hands behind our head and just kind of lay back a little bit, and just, as here we go, we're going towards the robots are taking over. It's going to be great, or they might kill us. And the idea that they were going to kill us comes from this deep fear that we are completely incompetent as human beings, and we know it. It's
to be
closer to
fair,
the stagnation theory, basically. Shit, we're actually not very good at anything. There's too much knowledge in the world anyway to be understood by one single person. Division of labor has made each and one of us kind of replaceable and incompetent in our own way, and we're not
sure.
gonna. And it's very deeply anti-humanistic as a mindset, and I relate to that, the being
To,
being
to,
where
to
you
be
are.
fair, to be fair, what else would you do against the robots? They are coming to take it over. Uh, like, I'm kind of tempted to just lay down and just relax.
No, I think the okay, I was going to go through what makes a good company, but to answer that question, and I'll go to that in a second and close. The answer towards that, I think his recommendation that I really like, it's not the final answer, but I like it as a proposal, is that we should really believe in a future of more of a symbiotic between man and machine. Let's not forget that robots are ultimately tools that we create for our benefit, and there's
Mhm.
something irreplaceable about being human that a robot will never be able to generate, not in 100 years. That's actually the truth. No matter what people with Cassandra complexes believe about the end of the world and the robot apocalypse like Elon Musk, there's just there's something about humanity and agency, and that the robots will never be able to have. And the best outcomes from growth perspective for our own well-being is that amazing combination between the one to n computational power of robots. At the moment, we're doing very well in terms of bits and data servers, but maybe applied to the world of atoms as well, manufacturing at scale, or and so on, or nuclear energy at scale that's safe. That combination of that axis and the axis of 0 to 1, which is intrinsically the ability of humans to create something out of nothing.
I like that the book is titled 0 to 1, and robots are all binary, right? It's all zeros and ones. So robots must read it and be like, oh my God, this is great.
Yeah. So if I were to close, I think if you're looking for kind of like the cheat sheet of this book, it's coming at page 153, which is there are 7 questions we need to ask ourselves. I need to ask myself about doing it when I try to do anything worthwhile, which is number one, the engineering question is, are you actually able to create something new, completely new, instead of just incremental improvement?
Yeah.
Number two is timing. If you want to have a successful enterprise of any sort, is now the right time to start that particular thing, or are you kind of late in the adoption cycle? And he gives this great anecdote in one of his speeches: is all the Harvard MBAs, which are extremely extroverted but have absolutely no idea what to do with their lives, timed the end of the dot-com bubble perfectly when it came to employment, and they just joined all those dot-com bubble companies in 2001 when all of them imploded. So there's a whole class of people that are just following the trend, following the crypto trend, following the whatever shit is in fashion, and it's a question about timing, and you kind of have to have your own beliefs about when things um, have arrived at their time, so to speak. The third question is the monopoly question. Are you starting with a big share of a small market? Was the idea. Google owning a very, very small market, but owning it 100% and not spreading its effort endlessly. Number four is people question. Now, I haven't really talked about it so much now, but there's a whole section, and I truly believe that, are you partnered with the right people in your team? Why are people doing it? What is the incentive structure? Are people motivated by kind of a flat salary, or is it equity? And what does equity really mean,
Hmm.
right? That part of the business that grows with you and your own efforts. Very important. You and me, we're, if anything, this is trivial effort, but if not, we are co-founders and equal equity partners in
Classic amateurs.
Classic Amateurs Inc. Number
The
five,
best monopoly.
it's got to write
Go
it,
for it.
write it. The distribution question, and a lot of people, I guess this applies a lot to techie people that are kind of nerdy. They think that engineering is everything. A lot of it is actually distribution and sales, because it's one thing is creating an amazing, even if it's an amazing conversation, but the other thing is other people knowing about it. So where do you actually distribute your product? Number six is the durability question, and Peter Thiel is actually a chess master, so he always thinks in not who does the first move, who has the first mover advantage, but who has the last mover advantage, who is the one giving the chess mate. So is your market position going to be defendable 10, 20 years from now? A lot of the value, and you know this because you've got the finance background, when you value a company, you do a discount cash flow model.
Cash flow.
Yeah, 80% of the value is in that terminal value, right? That's how you can fuck around and just give whatever value you want to your company, right? Because it's true, that's where most of the value is. It's in the exit.
That's how they calculate the net worth of celebrities as well. Yeah.
How they exit.
Yeah.
You exit at 27, like Amy Winehouse, and
Oh,
you
I
don't
don't
get the
know about.
discount.
I don't think that was a financial decision.
And number seven is the secret question. Have you identified that unique opportunity that others just don't see? Fuck
I don't
around
know.
time.
Fuck around time. There you go.
That's it for me.
Well, so this is our fuck around time podcast. Maybe we should have renamed it. I guess we should go through this and then build the best and only podcast that ever exists. Even if we need to ask the robots to take over every other podcast.
The only
But yeah,
classic podcast that is done by amateurs during their fuck around time.
there you go. There you go. Monopoly. Let's see if anyone else is interested. Thank you so much for that. This is great. Any
Thanks.
any final words?
That's it. Enjoyed it.
All
Recommend
right,
the book,
fine.
0 to 1, baby.
Sounds brilliant. 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel.